Hi, everyone. It's Darren. Thank you for joining me, and welcome to another edition of Coleman Wealth Home Office Edition. And we've been interviewing people that I think are thought leaders and folks that can give us some advice and some insight and perspective to help navigate us through this remarkable period of time. And today I'm delighted to have Mike Cirone join me from Tax Chambers. Mike is a cross-border attorney. You're like a unicorn, Mike. There are so few lawyers that specialize in working in both Canada and the United States. You're licensed in both places. I'm lucky to know you because you solve a lot of problems for our clients that have that situation. Just to introduce you to everybody, you've been a cross-border Canada-US attorney since 2003, and you've been an attorney since 2001. So for most of your career, you've been specializing in working with people that have family and issues in both Canada and the US and fall between the cracks of two very different legal systems. So before we jump into some of the tips and tricks and traps of cross-border planning, I'm curious as to why you decided to specialize in this area, because there's so few attorneys that do this. What made you want to make it really complicated and work in both countries at the same time?
Well, it comes down to my training, Darren. So I went to law school in the U.S. I worked in New York City for a couple years as a tax attorney in New York City. Then moved back to Canada. Got my license here as a lawyer in Ontario and practiced Canadian tax for probably 10 years. We started getting a lot more calls for cross-border issues at my firm. So we thought, okay, let's start a cross-border practice. So back in 2014, we started our cross-border practice, and since then I've been doing only that.
Wow.
So that's how it came about, kind of by accident. Yeah, but it
Well,
turns out that there's a lot of issues and a lot of work in this area, as you know.
oh yeah, I know. Well, that's, in our case, we always specialize in solving complicated wealth management and financial planning issues, and people with money or family on both sides of the border just became an increasingly large number of people we would meet that had that particular challenge. So we were able to begin specialize in it, just as you specialized in it, and that's how we know each other. Is that we are one of the very few people in each of our categories that really focuses on this problem. So I wanted to take 15 or 20 minutes today and just kind of skip through some of the more common situations that we see and help people that may have that issue understand that there are solutions available to them. So one of the things that we were talking about a little bit before is, even though this pandemic is happening, there's a lot of planning that people ought to be doing. And we'll start maybe with a common situation that we see, which we kind of call a mixed marriage, where we have the Canadian and American spouse. What are some of the challenges or issues that come up when you've got people that are one's Canadian, one's American, and they can both be living in Canada, both be living in the US, but they've got that you're from here, I'm from here. What complications come? Why is that complicated?
Well, the first thing is the rules are different on both sides of the border, right? So, and people don't think that. They think, well, Canada, U.S., they're both common law jurisdictions, should be about the same, but they're not. The rules are different. So, and the issues that come up are that wealthy people that should be doing cross-border estate planning don't even know they should be. That's the issue.
Right.
So they figure, well, I'll go to my Ontario estate planning lawyer. He or she will, do our wills, our plans, our trusts, and it should be okay.
Yes.
But what they don't realize is that, for example, a testamentary spousal trust for a Canadian spouse is fine on the first passing, but that's not fine from a U.S. perspective if the surviving spouse is a U.S. citizen. So you have to have special language and deal with it in special ways that it's not covered by just a regular Ontario testamentary spousal trust. So that's one of the traps. Yeah, some other traps are, Canadians that have U.S. kids. Either they're U.S. citizens living in Canada, or maybe they moved to the U.S., they've gone to school, they end up staying there, getting a job full time. There's definitely issues with that in terms of the inheritance. So a lot of times what we do is we have the inheritance go directly from the second spouse who passed away to a dynasty trust for the U.S. kids. That way, it's protected from U.S. estate tax, which is the U.S.'s death tax, which is a 40% hit. It's protected from creditors of the kids' creditors, and it's also protected from marital creditors if they get divorced. Because the last thing you want is, working hard all your life as parents, and then you pass away, your kids inherit they get divorced, married and divorced, and then half of it's gone. So that kind of planning is ideal to preserve that wealth long term, right? So that's a big thing that we do a lot for our clients, and some other. So another trap is the principal resident exemption for U.S. citizens. So the way it works is in Canada, as you know, you sell your principal residence, there's a gain, you don't pay any tax. Exactly.
Right. I bought it for 100 grand, it's worth $1 million, that's all for me.
That's right. But on the U.S. side, it's different. They only allow you $250,000 of exemption on gain per residence. And it's every 2 years, or some other rules as well. So a lot of the planning we do is to do some gifting strategies to gift, the percent owned by the U.S. citizen spouse to their non-U.S. citizen spouse, their Canadian spouse, during life, using up some of their exemption, which is 11.58 million now, so it's really high. Use it or lose it kind of thing. And then, when they sell the house in the Canadian spouse's name only, there's no U.S. tax on it. And
so before we get, sorry to interrupt, before we get too far down the rabbit hole of exemptions and stuff, I think there's a couple of things that may surprise Canadians, for example, and even some Americans living in Canada, which is that Americans and Canadians are taxed very differently in a number of ways. So we often see people say, listen, I don't live in the US, or maybe I was born there, but I don't perceive myself to be American. I'm living in Canada. Why do I care about what the US tax people think? I don't live there. It's not my problem. So if they're a US citizen, because a Canadian can think that. If a Canadian moves to the US, they're like, I don't care about Canadian taxes. What's the difference between how an American deals with taxes and a Canadian? Because this is important, isn't it?
This is actually the foundation of all the planning we do.
Right.
Are you a U.S. citizen? Are you a U.S. green card holder? Do you spend a lot of time in the U.S. and you're a U.S. taxpayer under the U.S. substantial presence test? Because you have to do that first. Once you know that, then you can plan accordingly. And a lot of people, like you mentioned, they were born in the U.S., maybe came to Canada with their parents when they were 2 years old, and don't even consider themselves U.S. citizens. And a lot of times when I mention to the parents that your kids might be U.S. citizens, they'll respond and say, oh no, but for immigration, we never did this, never did that. And I would tell them that immigration and tax is two different
separate, aren't they? Yeah.
Separate, right? So a lot of times I'm the bearer of bad news on that, where I'll tell people that, by the way, your kids are U.S. citizens. Now, sometimes they choose to ignore it, which is not recommended, but
well, because Americans are taxed on citizenship. So it doesn't matter where in the world they live, they're going to have to file and possibly pay taxes to the United States. Canadians and most countries are taxed based on residency. So if you don't live here anymore and you go through the process of not being resident, you don't pay the taxes to Canada. You're still a citizen, but you don't have to pay taxes. But Americans, it doesn't matter. Wherever they live, they have to file to Uncle Sam, right? And that's what causes, I think, a lot of confusion for folks, is that as soon as you're recognized to be a U.S. tax filer, and that can come from a number of ways. And actually, you just touched on one of the first things that I know that you do is figure out with people, what are your obligations? Because were you born in the U.S.? Did you have a green card? And you talked about something called substantial presence test. I think this also surprises people. Take us through that a little bit, because that often gets people that go like, really? I didn't know that I was an American because of that.
Well, that's right. So if you don't have a green card, you're not a citizen, you think, well, okay, I go to the U.S. for, to my Florida property every once in a while, spend some time there, great.
But visit for 7 months.
Exactly. But if you do that every year, so in 1 year, if you spend more than 183 days, you could be a U.S. taxpayer. Or if you spend less than that, but over a period of 3-4 years, once you do the formula, you fit into that rule, then you're a U.S. taxpayer. There's obviously ways out of that. There's some elections you can make and kind of elect out of that, and closer connection, all types of things you can do. But yeah, that does catch people a lot. So that if you're a U.S. taxpayer, then you have to file a U.S. tax return. If you don't, and don't file all the forms as well, you're subject to all these penalties and all that kind of thing. And another thing to consider is that U.S. tax law is different than U.S. transfer tax laws. So for example, so what that means is, as you mentioned, if you're a U.S. citizen, right, you're a taxpayer in the U.S. no matter where you are.
Right.
Right. If you're a U.S. green card holder living in the U.S., then you're taxable there. But
right.
You can still be that's tax, income tax. But when it comes to the U.S. estate tax and the gift tax in the U.S.,
oh, that's the transfers. from person
Yes,
to
it's
person?
based on
Yes.
U.S. domiciliary status, which means it's a factual test, kind of like the Canadian departure tax test. You know, what are your ties with the U.S.? You know, what are your plans long term in terms of where you're going to be living, your domicile?
Right.
That's got nothing to do with all the other things we talked about, right? So you
That's
can
a
be a
third component. Wow. Okay.
exactly, and that's
I feel like
totally
I'm in
separate from tax.
quicksand, Mike. We keep getting sucked into more complicated stuff when you dig into this, isn't it?
It is. It is. And then another thing that happens is people leave the U.S. Who are on a green card. They come to
Okay.
Canada, they
Yeah.
don't renew their green card, and they think that, okay, I'm not a U.S. taxpayer anymore.
Aha.
Normally, that's probably the cise, but you have to look at U.S. domiciliary status to say, okay, if I die, am I subject to U.S. estate tax? Because even though you're not a U.S. taxpayer, you can still be a U.S. domiciliary because all your ties are still in the U.S., even though you think you gave your green card up, right? And then on top of
Wow.
that, you have to actually do certain things to give your green card up for tax purposes.
Okay, while we're on that topic of green card and giving it up, I'm going to just change gears a little bit because we sometimes have people ask us this question. They say, listen, I was an American, I was born there, or I was there when I was 2, or I had my green card. I gave it up and I'm not American anymore. But it's not like they click their heels 3 times and say, I'm not American, I'm not American, I'm not American. There is actually a process they have to go to is through to renounce their citizenship, right?
So
And
that's
we saw
right.
people when Trump got elected said, I'm out of here. And but what's that process? Just to give us a little picture of, it's not as easy as just saying I'm not American anymore.
No, it's similar to the Canadian system where you leave Canada, you have to go through an analysis to say, you know, have I cut my ties with Canada? Am I subject to the departure tax on my assets? So on the U.S. side, they have something called the exit tax.
Right.
So it's a similar kind of test, but what happens is you have to see if you meet the threshold. You know, if your net worth has to be under $2 million at the time of leaving. You know, so if you don't meet that test, then you're okay on that front. But if your net worth is over 2 million, you've got certain taxable income over the last 3-4 years, and you know you even though you've been filing, you may have an exit tax to deal with, right? So, and if that happens, you're considered a covered expatriate. It's a nice name, and there's all kinds of bad things that happen to you after you leave the U.S. So first of all, you would have an exit tax to pay. You would, you know, any gifts you make, even after you're in Canada, it could be subject to gift tax or state tax. So there's all these bad things that happen.
I
Now,
notice
the good
when lawyers
news
say bad, sorry, I know when lawyers say when bad things happen, that means expensive, right? It's expensive
exactly.
things happen, right?
Yeah, but the good news is that there's planning to do
Okay.
to decrease your net worth. You know, like you can do gifting between spouses and different kind of strategies to get yourself under the covered expatriate threshold. So that's where, you know, I'm usually called in to kind of look at, do they meet the test or not? If they do, is there ways that we can mitigate their net worth, et cetera, and get them under because the funny thing is, if you're under the covered expatriate test, you can leave the U.S. and there's no departure tax there's no tax on, there's no exit
Well,
tax.
because that's like Uncle Sam's last chance to get their taxes out of you before you leave, right?
Exactly.
So they do have rules because they want to get whatever last bit of tax they can before you go. So we talked about a couple things, which is you know, we have situations where families may have one spouse is Canadian, one's American, or they didn't realize they were American, or they suddenly became American, which again, immigration and tax are not the same. So you can become American just because you were there, not because you did any filings for immigration status. I want to dig into the transfers thing for a bit more because I think this also surprises Canadians because we can give our family member as much money as we want and nobody cares. But Americans, no, right? That's where a lot of the planning has to be done because they aren't permitted to just give whatever they want away, can they?
That's right. There's a U.S. gift tax, right? And yeah, so the U.S. gift tax on gifts, although you have an exemption. So
Yes.
the first, so as we said, before Trump was in, it was 5.5 million. So the first 5.5 million of gifts you give to people, you just would use up your exemption.
Yes.
And then you would have no exemption for your death tax. So it's the same exemption. Now Trump's brought it up to 11.5 million. And that's why a lot of people are using it to do some gifting between people.
While the limit's really high.
While its limit's really high, use it or lose it.
There.
It may not stay there. No, for sure. If the Democrats get in, we're not sure it's probably going to come back down to 5 million.
Or less.
In 2025, it comes down automatically.
Right. So in 2025, that number gets reduced back to like $1 million. But also the U.S. just spent $2 trillion and counting to fight the coronavirus. So they're going to need some tax dollars pretty soon.
That's right.
So to me, this takes on a bit more urgency for folks, right?
Well, that's
Now,
right.
the other thing I want to jump to in our time is so we've got situations of families and people not knowing they're American or they may have married a Canadian. But one of the other common situations we also see are people where they have a property in the United States. And we see this mistake all the time. They've got that Florida condo, they've got that Arizona condo. What are some of the kind of traps that people fall into or things they don't think about or tips you can give them when they've got that second property in the sun somewhere, or it's a ski chalet in New York or something that they don't get right that you can help make sure they do get right?
Well, so this is another trap, as you mentioned. A lot of Canadians seem not to know that if you have U.S. site as property, real estate or stocks, that kind of thing, and you're high net worth, you may be subject to the U.S. estate tax on your debt, which is 40%. And it's 40% of the value and not of the gain, right?
Oh, hang on a minute. That's going to surprise people. So we in Canada think about tax on the gain. You're saying it's 40% of the value of the asset.
That's right, at death, yes.
Wow.
So it can be huge.
So they've got a property for $1 million in Florida. The IRS may want 400,000 and not Canadian dollars. They want American dollars, the real ones, right?
Well, exactly. No, exactly. So Canadians also have a bit of an exemption under the treaty and under tax law generally. But the way it works, it's a prorated exemption. So it's not the full exemption that the U.S. citizens will get. So you have to watch. It basically gives you an exemption that's a pro rata formula based on your U.S. site as property divided by your worldwide property.
Got it.
Right. So if it's, like you said, they have a $1 million property in Florida, but they're worth, 10 million, then you only get 1/10 of the deduction. So the exemption. So you have to watch that, and you have to also watch not to set up something the wrong way, and then have to deal with it after, because that's a lot more complicated and a lot more expensive. Because if you buy that $1 million property and realize 5 years down the road that it's not held properly in terms of structuring, you have to figure out a way to get you into the right structure. So it might involve doing a cross-border reorganization of some sort. There's FIRPTA issues on the U.S. side, which is the Foreign Investment in Real Property Tax Act. So any foreigner, non-U.S. person that owns U.S. real estate, if you're transferring or selling it, you have to do some compliance. So you either have to pay withholding tax on it, or do some compliance beforehand to get a waiver of that FIRPTA tax. So it's very complicated. So the best advice I could give people is to do it right the first time, obviously. And it's really easy. We can put it into a trust structure or some kind of, that's going to work well for generations, protect the assets from U.S. estate tax from creditors, etc., as opposed to coming to me after the fact, which happens a lot, right? People just, and another issue just on that point is Canadians will get U.S. advisors that don't know about Canadian tax to tell them, oh yeah, you need this LLC to hold your U.S. rental properties.
Right.
And then when they talk to me or to you, we'll tell them that that's definitely not a good structure for Canadians. So you got to watch that, because
we encounter that. Yeah, we encounter that often. They'll be down in Florida and they'll be by the pool with the family from Michigan. And the family from Michigan will say, whoa, you got to go see the guy in town because he's going to set up a limited liability corporation. That's how you don't want to own it in your own name. You want to put it in the company. And here's all the reasons why. And that may be very valid for the American. But the minute the Canadian follows that same path, sees that Florida attorney, and they do it, the Florida attorney may not know that the Canadian is subject to maybe 70% tax rates.
That's right.
They don't know that.
That's right.
We know that. There's a few other issues that we see sometimes that I'm just going to kind of bring out there. One thing that we've encountered is where people will have an estate and they'll appoint an executor that either can't act, because we see people, mom or dad will be in Canada, they'll appoint their eldest child that lives in the US. That creates a bunch of problems. We've also seen situations where a Canadian estate has suddenly become taxable in the US when they never thought it would, because the executor's domicile suddenly matters a whole lot.
Exactly.
So this is a bit of a minefield, isn't it? So what you and I see happen quite often is people will set out and try, and number one, they go and get good advice. We also see the people that don't think anything bad will ever happen and never get a will or power of attorney, which is just crazy. Especially now when there's a virus, might be
I'll
important.
tell you about my
Actually,
story after.
yeah. So actually, why don't we talk about that right now? Because this, I think, anyone that was delaying their planning, I think that this takes on added urgency. And you were just telling me a story a little while ago about a client that you're not sure what's going on. So maybe just share that if you don't mind.
Sure, and actually I have an update for you since I spoke to you
Oh,
last.
good. Okay.
So I have a client that we were doing cross-border estate planning for quite a bit of time. It's really a complicated estate. Husband's Canadian, very wealthy, owns a lot of real estate in the city, and wife is an American citizen. Hence the problem of the mixed marriages, right?
Right.
So I hadn't heard from the client for a couple months, and even the Ontario estate planning lawyer was asking me if he's heard from them, and we hadn't heard from them. Then I get an email out of the blue about 3 weeks ago, and the email says I'm COVID-19 positive. Okay, he says let's get on with it. Let's expedite the process.
I got the virus.
Got the virus. Then the next day I get another email from him saying I'm in the hospital. I'm in ICU now.
Wow.
Now he's got the virus and he's also on a ventilator.
And we also hear stories about how fast this can progress if people suddenly have other conditions, and this can be very, very dangerous.
Exactly. So I get that email. I'm starting to do the work, and I don't hear from him for a couple of weeks. So I'm thinking worst. And
Sure.
obviously his health is the most important thing. But aside from his health, if he had passed away, and he didn't, I'll tell you the good news after. So if he had passed away, let's say that the wife would have received, let's call it $30 million of assets in her personal name.
Okay.
She's a U.S. citizen. When she passes away, guess what?
Ooh.
A 40% hit of the U.S. estate tax.
Wow. $12 million.
So the whole point of our planning was to make sure that she has a proper bypass trust in the wills, so that when she gets everything, it goes to a trust and not to her, and then therefore it's protected from U.S. estate tax.
So this is millions of dollars of taxes that you're able to structure them to not have to pay if they can get the planning done.
Yeah. And in this case here, I was hired to just review and vet the Ontario estate planning lawyer's Ontario will.
Okay.
And I took the testamentary trust and said, okay, you have to add these couple things. And so that's why I was hired on this file. The good news is I just got another email from him a couple days ago, and he said, I'm home now, believe it or not. And he says, I'm okay. I'm still not feeling great, but he says, I feel 1,000 times better than I did. I was in the hospital.
Wow.
And I asked him, I said, do you have any pre-existing conditions? And he said, no. He's a runner. He's healthy. He's about my age. I'm 48, so he's about my age. Maybe he's 50. And so it's a very scary thing. But the good thing is now we're on the ball and we're moving forward with all the planning in a fast way. So that's great.
Yeah. There's no flies on him now. He now understands how important it is, right?
Crisis averted. Yes.
Yeah, I can't take anything for granted. I'm glad to hear that has a positive ending, because I know when we first talked, you were in limbo, not knowing what had happened, right?
Well, yeah, I was texting the wife constantly, trying to get her to respond, and nothing. So and he did say, obviously they got the text, but they were just so engulfed in their situation, of course, on the health side.
Yeah.
But everything's working out now.
Well, and I think there's a lesson for people that if they haven't had a health issue that provides urgency, that's good, but they shouldn't just sit back and think, I got plenty of time. I think if there's a situation where you've got money or family or assets and they're in both countries, and it may be you, your spouse, your kids, your parents, you've got to begin interfacing with someone that can help with that. And as you mentioned, we see this all the time. They go to a domestic only practitioner and they miss so many things, and it can be wildly expensive. And unfortunately, nobody tends to know until it's too late and you can't fix it, or it's, as you said, it's a big problem, which means expensive, right? So one of the things that we try to do is when people are going through the process and we know that there's a cross-border element, and the reality is for most families, there's somebody or something that's probably in the US, we try to get them in front of someone like you, and you specifically, because we want to make sure that nothing gets missed the first time. And you do work with if they have a domestic practitioner, we can have you audit or double check to make sure there's no surprises, right? That's valuable to do. And we've also had to have you come in sometimes if there's, I call it forensic planning, when it's, oh, geez, what went wrong? How do we fix it? Right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So I'm going to close it there. This is such a deep topic that it's going to very quickly, if we keep going down the rabbit hole, get really technical, which is just the nature of the beast, right? But what I want people to take away from this is that if they do have that cross-border reality in their planning somewhere, and we've either spotted it or if they know someone that has it, you are like a unicorn, because there are and I can tell there's a handful, and I mean literally a handful of attorneys that we know that work and specialize in both Canada and the US. And you're operate like we are, you're operational in both places, right? Like you can act and write wills and trusts and things both in Canada and the US. You don't have to like throw
That's
the ball
right.
and hope someone else catches it.
That's right. It's a seamless offering where clients just need one counsel, just me, to
Right.
implement and plan on both sides. Yeah, just like your practice.
Well, and it's funny, we had someone ask me once, they said, yeah, but isn't Mike going to be more expensive? And I said, well, what's your comparison? Yes, he's going to be a little more than a domestic only person, but he's cheaper than two, which you'd have to get otherwise. And we've also unfortunately seen the situation where people have competent on each side, but they don't even know when they drop the ball. That's a problem too.
Well, exactly. So, you know, whereas two separate, you know, you have a U.S. counsel and you have a Canadian tax planning counsel trying to come up with a solution for a client, I've come across those already. So I have solutions kind of, you know, ready and available. Obviously, they have to be tweaked for each client, but you know, you spend less time going through back and forth to see if something works.
Right.
So that's what I find when there's two counsel on both sides. They're kind of trying to trade ideas and they just can't seem to get it to work.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And you already know the answers. And we're very fortunate because normally in a non-COVID world, you're literally in the office building next to me. We're neighbors. Right. But right now, I guess with the technology, we're all neighbors, aren't we? It doesn't matter.
That's right.
Anymore.
That's
well,
right.
Listen, Mike, thank you for your time today. I know we'll talk again. You and I talk frequently anyway, but if we have any clients that are interested in having Mike do a review or double check, let us know. And I'll put Michael, your contact details will be somewhere in the magic of YouTube. I'll have your contact info in the section of notes or something. So I'll make sure people know how to find you too. But thank you for your time today, and we'll talk again. Thank you, my friend. Stay safe.
Okay, Darren, thanks so much.
For everybody else.
Okay, thanks. Take care. Bye.
Bye.